Hi. While recovering from the shock of the attack on the Christmas market in Germany, which cost at least 5 lives and injured over 200, I wanted to consider the drone and UFO hype in the media, and as part of that analyzed Dr. Greer. He is almost 70 years old, a retired trauma doctor, and before that he ran meditation workshops, but he is best known as a ufologist, advocating for decades the disclosure of alleged classified UFO information. He claims he had close encounters with extraterrestrials when 8 and 18 years old, and in between had a near-death experience, making him realize that there's a vast cosmic consciousness out there. He also seemed to have had major injury on his right ear, which I couldn't find out much about. In light of so much propaganda, I turned to analyzing body language, which is hard and in some cases even impossible to fake, especially fleeting expressions which bypass conscious thought. Of course, there are covert intensive training programs, mind control and manipulation of recorded material by AI, making it difficult to understand what's true and false. Here I'm looking at a number of different video clips providing a good overview of Greer's behavior and its variability. Let's get started.
Following your work for a lot of years, and particularly that video that you put out, where there were like 400 or some people that worked for the government, and they all stood up at the podium and they spoke. I was amazed that you put that out there. But I read an article that you had put out talking about Buzz Aldrin. He had died back in November, and you put the article out about his death and how his family couldn't speak about.
So first impressions. So here we see him in front of a room full of grown-ups. It looks impressive. Him just alone discussing UFOs, a sensitive topic. When you see him, you get a mixed vibe of physical therapist, maybe military, and he looks very confident, sharp, and eloquent. And he looks incredibly fit for his age.
I think that was Neil Armstrong, actually.
Neil Armstrong.
Yeah, the first man to walk on the moon.
Exactly. And you said that when he landed, he saw something that he couldn't talk about?
Yes.
What was it? Yeah.
This is a really great question about what really happened. You know, my uncle worked for Grumman, that became Northrop Grumman, and Grumman had the contract to build the lunar module. It landed, a funny-looking thing that looked like a spider. It landed on the moon.
So there are two things already very early on. So on one hand, he looks very believable. His facial expressions and hand gestures are congruent with his verbal speech. He uses illustrators a lot, his hands, to support his speech. He doesn't use pacifiers or adapters, so he doesn't dissipate stress, which would be a sign of lying, which he's not doing. On the other hand, there's already a red flag. So somehow his uncle worked on the lunar project. As I read as well, his dad was in the Navy, and then also Stephen was in close contact with the astronauts, so the tight community, and he has been debriefing for decades governments. So he's very close to the source. He's closely linked to those people. Either it's a big coincidence, or it would be just incredibly hard to disclose material if you're not already close to these kind of communities.
69 on July 20th or whatever it was. The first two men on the moon were Neil Armstrong, and after him Buzz Aldrin.
So here's another believable thing about him. He's correct in himself. And then he makes pauses. He certainly thinks. He's tapping into his memory. You can see it with his eye movements and the pauses. So that, again, is very congruent with someone telling the truth. And so these are good signs.
And back when we were doing these briefings for Congress, and in fact even before then, the Asilomar gathering in 1995, we reached out to Neil Armstrong because I knew from contacts and family that when we landed on the moon, we weren't alone. And
one other thing comes to mind when you look at him close up. So there are some particular key features of his face. So first there's his scarred skin, presumably that came from acne when he was young. And the interesting thing is about acne is it can be caused by fear and boundary issues. So fear in the sense that someone is quite sensitive and in order to protect himself from the environment, from people around him, he creates this protective thick skin. So later also he says, or in other videos, in interviews, he says he had this near-death experience, that he's not afraid anymore because of that experience. But of course, if he has some particular core fear he suffered from early on, he can, of course, that can overpower other types of fears, and he might appear not afraid anymore. Of course, on the other hand, someone like that could be prone to believe into aliens, supernatural stuff, life after death, and these kind of things might come natural to a person like that. The second thing is a big feature in his face, an important feature is his mouth. So it's a bit like Mick Jagger. He's, of course, a world-famous singer, and so the mouth is his instrument, his voice. And similar here. So, of course, I don't know if he's a singer, but he's certainly a very good speaker, a very good communicator, and that you can see immediately from his facial features. In physiognomy, you assume the face is carved by lifelong experiences, and these create features in the face. And so that would indicate the importance of verbal speech is reflected in the shape and size of his mouth. The third feature which comes to mind is his ear. So he seems to have had some major injury. Maybe it was partially torn off, but I don't know if it was related to his near-death experience or if it's unrelated. I have no idea. I couldn't find out anything about it.
Contacts and family that when we landed on the moon, we weren't alone. And that Neil Armstrong, there were two people who've been on my team for many years who are good friends of his family.
So again, we see the close connection to this tight astronaut community. So that's a bit of a red flag. So on one hand, he's trying to disclose information and going against everyone, and on the other hand, he's part of it, which is a contradiction.
And so we reached out to him and invited him to come to those events, and he politely declined, and told us that it was made very clear to him and the other Apollo astronauts who witnessed this first event, where when we landed at the crater on the moon, the rim at the top of the crater was, quote, crowded with UFOs.
So, of course, he uses the illustrators, and it looks congruent and very believable. On the other hand, it contradicts what many now think about the lunar missions, that they were essentially fake. That with an origami lunar module, you can't fly through vacuum and through a radiation field and survive that. It seems to contradict current knowledge. And of course, don't forget that the video material of the mission disappeared. So he's basically now saying the lunar missions happened, and on top of it, the moon was crowded with UFOs. So that's, of course, extremely hard to swallow. And does it make sense? I mean, if they are super intelligent aliens who can do space travel, then they dump their UFOs on the moon so they can easily be found by humans and discovered.
And that I know people personally who've seen that film footage. And that's why the film footage that came back to the Earth, we did go to the moon. But some of the footage, it doesn't make sense because the flag is moving. Now, the reason for that, and this is where people say we didn't go to the moon, it was all hoax.
So here he very confidently has folded his hands on his lap, which is again a good sign. I mean, it could be interpreted as a protective gesture, but sitting in front of people like that, this is completely normal and a sign of being relaxed.
And filmed in a basement up in New York. The flag is moving. Now, the reason for that, and this is where people say we didn't go to the moon, it was all hoax and filmed in a basement up in New York. The truth is we went, but during the lunar orbiter, going back before the Apollo mission, we actually were circling the Earth taking the first early digital photographs. And as you know from the testimony of Disclosure Project witness Carl Wolf,
misspoke just now.
There were structures on the moon that were artificial. Some were newer and some were very ancient. And so they knew the covert programs, and these images were being downloaded to out here at Langley not the CIA headquarters, Langley Air Force Base, to a...
So lots of illustrators making this very believable. In between he was rubbing his fingers and the legs with his hands, so small dissipation of stress, but it's completely normal when you sit in front of an audience.
Compartmented operation run by the National Security Agency that was then sequestered away from the other NASA scientists. But the people running that project, the deep black people in those projects, knew that it was likely we were going to encounter something not of this world or a UFO when we landed. Therefore...
So now he makes a steepling position even at this very critical moment where he comes up with this alternative interpretation of history. And so the steepling position is a sign of great confidence. Experts often do it.
They had filmed some footage that they could splice in if something started happening. So during the live transmission, if something started happening, there's a delay that went through this National Security Agency filter, and they could immediately, instantly put in. And that's why there's a couple frames where the American flag is moving. Well, there's
what an unbelievable story. Yeah, it's hard to believe.
No atmosphere on the moon, okay? Which was the one mistake they made in that whole plan.
So here we see nicely in his eyes and the lines between the eyes. This is an expression of fear. So he has an intrinsic fear, which makes him, of course, easily look fearless when he can easily deal with other types of fears other people might have problems with. Just an observation on this side.
It's the telltale giveaway.
Yeah, so here the eyes tell a different story. There's a great fear underlying everything.
Now, some people have taken that, the conspiracy theorists have said, we didn't even go to the moon. We did go to the moon. But they knew that it was likely there were going to be ETVs, extraterrestrial vehicles up there.
So that's such a ludicrous story. I mean, here's already, it builds assumptions on assumptions. So here's the assumption is that they knew already beforehand that there would be UFOs on the moon or that there would be likely encounters. It's a very, very strong assumption. And the whole story hinges on it. But the main red flag I have here is that he is attempting to define what is an okay conspiracy theory and what is not an okay conspiracy theory. So it's an okay conspiracy theory to believe that the moon is crowded with UFOs, but it's not an okay conspiracy theory to think that the whole lunar mission was a hoax, based on what we know about space travel now and the difficulties. Certainly we see it in much more realistic terms compared to people in the 1960s.
And so when they stepped out, of course, and we're approaching actually, before they even landed, they saw them. So they were already with this sort of pre-prepared.
So I would imagine if they really flew to the moon with a little origami lunar module, there would be instructions now essentially online. You could ask ChatGPT to explain to you how this would work, how these technical difficulties could be overcome. I'm sure ChatGPT should be able to figure that out if they could figure it out decades ago. There should be clear instructions, how to put a huge container of rocket fuel under your butt and then ignite it and make a little foldable a lunar module and survive radiation and vacuum. And then I would imagine by now that there would be a lot of hobby astronauts building that themselves in their garages. But it doesn't happen, and none of the original plans are available, which is, of course, super surprising and a huge red flag.
That looked very, very good, except for this one error. And so Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin know for a fact. Now, Neil Armstrong said, look, if I were to go forward and talk about what actually happened, I've been told, Neil Armstrong said this to us, that my wife, my children, and my grandchildren would all be killed, that they would take us out somehow.
Nevertheless, he is still alive after decades of trying to disclose covert information. So he doesn't seem to be afraid and nothing happens to him. On the contrary, he's going to congressional hearings and having these seminars or whatever that is here. He's very outspoken, and additionally, he's not censored. These videos have hundreds of thousands of views, and some of these channels he's on have millions of subscribers. So there's no censorship whatsoever. So this all tells a completely different story.
What are your just basic thoughts about this phenomenon of things in the sky? There you go.
Well, I mean, as you know, I've predicted this sort of thing would happen for 30 years. There's a covert rogue military component that is behind all these drone sightings. Some of them are drones, some of them are a little more advanced.
Drone sightings.
And most of them are part of a rogue military operation to basically create a psychological warfare effect in the media and in the public in advance of something that nobody knows is going to happen, but I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. So there's a group of
the psychological part is working, by the way. We're all scared. We're all terrified.
Yeah, you should be. So this is very serious. So there's a group of guys who I've known for about 18, 19 months who are senior intel and aerospace operatives out of some desert locations. I'm not going to mention where they are. I've been to them, where most of the R&D testing and operations dealing with so-called UFOs, UAPs occur. Now, this guy, the main guy, has 6 other black sites, as they're called, operational sites that are very secretive, and are these particular ones are ones that are rogue and been running illegally for a long time.
So what is the first impression? So again, on one hand, he looks quite believable. I mean, we can't see his hands in terms of illustrators, but again, his facial expressions and everything is very congruent. There's no indication of lying at this moment. But on the other hand, he's unloading a massive amount of difficult to understand information. So before he talked about, UFOs being crowding the moon and everything, and the lunar mission, everything was fine and so on. But now he even goes further and talks about covert rogue military groups which trying to frighten the public to overthrow the governments in a tyrannical way, and that there are black ops sites, and that he had certain collaborations for so and so many months, and so on and so on. It's an overload of information, and you almost forget what you wanted to ask or what you would like to ask, because it's assumptions upon assumptions upon assumptions. So you would have to start from the beginning, basically. And if these are really rogue groups, then how is it possible that they fly all over the United States? I mean, it's a huge logistic problem, and they are near military sites apparently, and nuclear sites. And how is it not possible that the police or military tracks them or shoots them down or anything like that? So it really smells like a massive false flag operation or a psyop. Here he appears more and more like a salesperson pushing a certain agenda. In the end, what he's doing here, he agreed with that. He said he should be worried. So he fuels the frenzy and lends credibility to it all. Like he's really made for this particular moment. So his whole character seems to be made for this moment.
HI or extraterrestrial, those are so advanced, you're obviously not going to be going from one star system to another at anything that's the speed of light. You're going to have to go through an entangled aspect of the universe through gravity. It kind of like that. It's more the creation of through gravitational waves, being able to basically bend space and time.
So he made an interesting facial expression when he talked about gravitational waves. So he squinted his eyes. So it seemed to indicate that he wasn't really sure at this moment anymore. It was more like a question. Gravitational waves? like he's not sure himself. So here he exposed himself a tiny bit.
If you look at point A to B through 1,000 light years of space, and look at it as a straight line, like on a piece of paper, fold the piece of paper. Mm-hmm. They're like this. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's
fold the piece of paper. So what he's offering is really not a lot. So on the one hand, he says he has been investigating these covert UFO technologies, or people involved in these exploring these technologies. So I would imagine after these decades of investigating this, one would know more about the technologies. But what he is just offering is extremely vague explanation borrowed from sci-fi movies, Even the folding of the paper with the wormholes, I think I know from certain movies like First Contact, or no, Contact, I think it was called. And he's using concepts from introductory physics courses like Physics 101, talking about gravitational waves. What does it have to do with anything? A bit of quantum entanglement, a bit of quantum mechanics. It sounds all very good, but there's no detail, nothing new being offered.
That's the sort of technology. Unfortunately, some of the worst people on the planet have it. It is not known by, I don't know of a president since I've been working on this who's been read in or briefed on it properly.
So here he seemed to have deflected. So he stopped his talk about technology, which he didn't really explain, and then he interrupted himself and went to the next story about that the worst governments have this kind of technology. So he's sort of spinning his own narrative somehow, avoiding, it looks like, having to talk about the technology he doesn't seem to know about.
So that's been 34 years.
Are the worst people other leaders or just bad people we have in America? Or
This is
just
the covert rogue military operation, right?
It's covert, rogue, military, corporate. I'd say the center of power on this is corporate. But there are people who are embedded in the Pentagon and even in the House and Senate, and I know who a couple of them are.
So here he does a lot of shoulder shrugs. He touched his ear when he said, saying Congress, he knows them and so on. So that didn't seem very believable. He also avoided the look into the camera. He doesn't seem to be sure about what he's saying right now.
I'm not going to go into it too much right here, but they're part of that organization, and they're mainly there to just, none of this is true, and to just sort of gaslight their colleagues, because like the Senate is a club of 100 guys and women, and it's not hard to deceive them, and if it's coming from one of your senior colleagues, you're going to think it's real. Like if a doctor tells another doctor, or a lawyer another lawyer, there's a built-in affinity group, sort of credibility. So those have been embedded. And there are people embedded within the Pentagon, although to get people up to speed on how kind of, as screwed up you think Washington is, it's more screwed up. So, I mean, as bad as you think it is.
Could I just go back to the beginning for a second and we can walk our way through? Because
Ben Rich was the head of the famous Lockheed Skunk Works. He said, anything you can imagine, we've already done at the Lockheed Skunk Works. He said, not at Area 51. The real action is the Lockheed Skunk Works. It's in underground facilities. And he says, anything you've seen portrayed on Star Trek, we can do it, and we've done it. So now this.
Well, wait a minute. You can beam people? Because that seems like the coolest thing. Beam me down to a planet.
They do. Yeah, they do have technologies for what's called teleportation. Of course, in physics, if you look it up, it's happened with particles through what's called entanglement. Quantum entanglement, where every point in space and time is interconnected.
Absolutely vague explanations. Again, very basic physics introductory stuff. How to get from basic physics to beaming people on a planet is a mystery to me, and he has nothing to offer here. So in summary, on one hand, his body language and the speech are congruent. There are a lot of illustrators and very little adapters and pacifiers, which would be indicators of lying. So these are missing largely. So he looks truthful, he looks authentic even, he looks likable. So he's a nice nerdy character, fun person to talk to presumably. However, I have my doubts. Without any evidence, it is just, it's just difficult to believe in all of this. In aliens, UFOs, and rogue military groups. Especially after the questionable lunar mission. And this type of confusion and distrust and distraction and fear-mongering is exactly what we would expect current governments are doing these days. While he might be saying the truth, there are two alternatives which point towards a type of long con. So the first one is he could be, hypothetically speaking, mind-controlled from early age on, so that he's exactly prepared for this role decades later to lend credibility to certain ideas which are playing out now. That there are UFOs and rogue groups and so on and so on. There's something also about his face, something odd about it. If you think of physiognomy, where the character of someone is reflected in the face, there's something strange about it, and maybe that reflects something odd about his character. So, of course, that's just speculation. And the second thing is, another possibility is that he practiced for this role for decades. That he's playing this role, that he's basically put in this character, he doesn't leave it really, and you learn to play this role so well that it becomes his second nature, it becomes absolutely believable. So he's essentially part of this whole psyops, this psychological war against the people, and the distrust he's trying to create, and the fear. So the latter hypothesis is then supported by his closeness to the military, to the lunar missions, to the governments. So how can someone like him be so close to the source? It's a big mystery to me. And also second, the lack of censorship. He's doing fine after decades of trying to reveal secret information. He's still giving public speeches and interviews. How is this possible? How is this not censored at least? How is he still doing that? And I hope you found this analysis useful. I'm certainly interested in your comments, what you think about this guy and the whole UFO scenario. And yeah, again, thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.